I want to talk about a subject that some people they are having a hard time dealing with it nowadays. And what I want to talk about is resting. Yes, some people have a really hard time resting nowadays. I'm specifically talking about a Sabbath resting or a Shabbat resting, when it's a productive type of rest and it's actually a biblical type of rest as well. Because remember that God, He created the universe, everything that we see around us, in just 6 days, and He rested on the seventh, right? And I always say this to people: did God need to rest? No, He doesn't need to rest. He's not human. He's not like us that we need the restorative rest, right? God doesn't need that. But He wanted to show us that we do need that rest. That's why He rested, and He was very specific about that on the seventh day. If you're here to learn about rest and also to learn about other things that I provide on this channel, and you want to help us grow, all you got to do is hit the subscribe button, hit the like button as well. This helps the platform understand that this is a relevant content and we'll deliver this to more people. That's all you got to do if you want to help this channel. I appreciate you, and let's talk about resting. I recently did a video about ultradian cycle, which is, we have two main cycles in our body, which is the circadian cycle, which is every 24 hours, more or less, and the ultradian cycle, which is about 90 minutes cycle. It goes exactly like this, like waves, and that's more related to productivity, right? And it's about 90 minutes. So if you consider that you want to hit peak productivity, right? You have to understand about the ultradian cycle, when you're hitting that peak productivity and when you need to rest. And the rest phase is as important as your productivity phase. And that's what people tend to not, take good care of. It's the rest phase. When in our society nowadays, like everything is fast moving, people were going, at 1,000 miles an hour all the time, and people are not really respecting rest because unfortunately we created a society that, people that are always busy, they get a lot of praise, right? That you probably have that type of friend that he or she is always busy and always saying, I'm, extremely busy. I don't have time for this. I don't have time for that. And some people look at that and be like, wow, this person is busy, so he must be important, or she might be, a really important person to be that busy, But that's a culture that unfortunately we built around us, and that's very toxic, okay? And I'm not talking about just because we need rest to basically balance the other areas of our lives. We need rest to be restored, to be able to produce more, to be able to hit peaks of productivity. So if you look at the ultradian cycle, which is the 90-minute cycle that I told you, you hit the accelerator for 90 minutes and you rest for 10, 20 minutes. Really depends on each person. But in that rest phase, what is happening with your brain, with your body? Your brain is readjusting itself, okay? So you can actually hit another peak of productivity. So you can actually absorb the content and everything that you were doing properly, okay? So you need to respect the rest phase as well. And the rest is a great way for you to disconnect or disassemble yourself from that particular task. And sometimes that's very important because it puts you in a very creative state, okay? All the geniuses that of today and even from ancient times, they had rest periods and they understood about rest. And in fact, it was during the rest phase, sometimes during sleep or awake but resting, that they had the craziest ideas or the more creative ideas, and that's how powerful rest is. A question that I sometimes get is, how do I rest? right? Resting became such a kind of a difficult thing to do nowadays that people actually ask, like, how do I actually rest? How do I properly rest? And that's a good question if you think about it, because a lot of people, they're resting the wrong way. Yes, you can rest the wrong way. I read this phrase in a book that I'm reading right now that is like this: if you work with your mind, you rest with your hands. And if you work with your hands, you rest with your mind. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that if you're doing a lot of work that is mental, right? A lot of calculation or computer or, building, coding or building presentations, that you're working a lot with your mind. A great way to rest is with your hands, right? Doing some physical activities, doing, in this particular book that I'm reading, the author is saying that he rests by doing dishes, for example, right? Which is a manual type of work, but you're resting your mind. In the opposite side, if you work with your hands, right? If you have a physical work or you work a lot with your hands, a good rest is resting with your mind. How do I rest with my mind? Reading books, reading articles, studying, so that's resting with your mind. The most important thing is that you do rest. You do work on a restorative rest. And when you do rest, you have to, there are two aspects of resting that you need to pay attention to, okay? It's the time that you're resting, what's the actual time that you're resting, the amount of time, and the quality of that rest. How are you resting? If you are, for example, hitting mental exhaustion and you need to rest, and you suddenly grab your phone and you start scrolling and you start spending time on social media, or that's not a restorative rest usually, okay? That will trigger more dopamine in your brain, that will trigger peaks of dopamine in your brain that is not going to actually help you rest. So knowing how to rest is very important as well. And what happens when you don't rest? Well, I think you probably know the answer, right? Burnout. That's what happens when you don't rest. Burnout is your internal system saying, I give up, I can't continue like this. When you're overworking your engines, your internal engines, you hit a burnout. So to prevent burnout, you need to understand about resting cycles, okay? And you have to put in your mind that resting doesn't mean that you are basically doing nothing or you're feeling like you're not being productive. A restorative rest is actually for you to be more productive. And I think that's the switch that people need to, basically change in their heads, because rest got associated with, unproductivity, okay? And we need to disassociate that. Why is that? Because otherwise we fall into that trap of not needing, thinking that we don't need to rest because we always need to be hitting that pedal to the metal kind of philosophy. But we do need rest in order to actually be more productive. Also, another way to think about rest is what you don't do versus what you actually do, okay? When you're resting, and we're talking about restorative rest, what you shouldn't be doing while you're resting, right? If there are activities that actually trigger your dopamine, or activity that triggers behaviors that you don't want to do, those are activities that you shouldn't be using to rest, right? That's why I always say about grabbing your phone and hooking on social media, because that's not a restorative rest, okay? If you want to actually respect that ultradian cycle of productivity, rest, productivity. I always relate to resting and building yourself a restorative rest, right? To set yourself for productivity. I talk about this parallel when you are trying to grow muscle, right? When you're trying to grow muscle, what do you have to do? You have to work out, right? Heavy weight, and you have to actually destroy the muscle fibers. You have to actually disrupt the muscle fibers and the muscle is going to grow when the fibers are being restored. So then in that rest phase, okay? So if you want to grow muscle, it's basically destroying the muscle fibers when you work out, resting so that fiber can be restored, and then you do that over and over again, and that's how the muscle is, growing. It's the same thing with our productivity, with our minds. If you go pedal to the metal, you're not going to have that restorative rest in order to hit a higher peak of productivity. And lastly, I want to encourage you to practice the biblical Sabbath. Work 6 days, rest 1 day. And when I say rest 1 day, that doesn't mean that you don't do anything, okay? Remember, I'm talking about restorative rest, not talking about laziness. You work 6 days. On the 7th day, you give yourself time to rest. Also, when you do this, you're literally trusting God, because God created the world, like I said, in 6 days, the universe, everything in 6 days, and rested on the 7th to show us that we can do the same. That when we do this, the world is not going to collapse. You're not going to miss all the opportunities because you're resting on that 7th day. You're simply switching the balance on the things that you're pressing on, work-wise, your project, to your family, to priorities for your health, for your wellness. So that's basically you shifting the balance and actually balancing things out. So I encourage you to do this. Think about, of applying this maybe, once a month to begin with. So that's my encouragement to you. Try to apply the biblical Sabbath in your life. I know God is going to provide you with the wisdom on how to do that. And if you leave everything to God, if you say, God, I'm resting because I'm doing my part on the other 6 days, you're going to feel that peace that surpasses all understanding, that yes, your life is going to be in control. The world is not going to collapse because you're not hitting pedal to the metal and working 7 days a week, 24/7 mentality, 365 days a year. Okay? So enjoy your rest, and I'll see you on our next video. God bless you.